Here we are in the Marietta Square Market where people of all demographics are enjoying ice cream, coffee, and other things on this Sunday. Today we're going to talk about population composition. I'm Mr. Coulter and this is Human Geography. Today we're going to get into population composition, which is topic 2.3. So we're going to look at how the population breaks down and the important statistics that we need to understand for that. And the way that we're going to do this the most today is by looking at population pyramids. Population pyramids are these things that you can see in front of you. They are charts that help us to understand the breakdown of how old and how male or female a population is. So population pyramids are a crucial tool in a human geographer's tool belt. So it's a special bar graph that can visually display a country's distinctive population structure. So whenever we look at it, we see that the x-axis is representing the sex of the population. So that's the percent of male displayed on the left, and then the percent of female displayed on the right. So we can always see that in blue is male and red is female. So left and right, male left, female right. That is the x-axis. The y-axis is showing us the ages of the people. So the age of the population. They typically break those down into 5-year intervals. So like 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so forth. And the youngest is displayed at the bottom with the oldest at the top. So the reason it's called a pyramid is because in the first few stages, we see it look more shaped like a pyramid. This is the world's, the current 7.6 billion people that live in the world. This is the breakdown of how old the world is. At the top, we've got the post-reproductive years. In the middle, we've got the reproductive years. And in the bottom, we have the pre-reproductive years. All right, so one thing to understand is we look at these numbers and we want to know why these numbers are important is the dependency ratio. So the dependency ratio is defined as the number of people who are either too young to work, so that's year 0 to 14, like we said, or over 65, so people who are deemed too old to typically work. So some people may still work, but they set the number at 65 to understand that's like general retirement years. So if we see a larger dependency ratio, that implies that the financial burden is on the working aged people. So that means the people who are working are going to have to do a lot more to make up and pay for the young in education or the older in care. You can see here families with grandparents and their children. That is actually my parents with my child. So the grandparents of my child right there. The next is the population structure. So when we look at the population structure, we look at the number of males per 100 females in the population. That's known as the sex ratio. So that is the number of males per 100 females. So developed countries should have more females because females tend to live about 7 years longer on average. So women live longer on average, which means that if your country is normal, if everything is happening normally in a developed country, that means that the number should almost always be more women than men in a society. So if we look at this map of the world and we look at more men than women in a society in blue, about the same in a goldish tan color, I guess, I don't know what you call that, and then more women than men in that pinkish purple color, we can see countries that are developed typically have more women than men. And then countries that have some sort of significant change to it or something is happening in that society, we see more men than women. So if you look at India as a great example, often in India, we see that as people are having less children and they want to have to take care of less children, they would prefer males because the males will provide for them as they get into their older years. So people self-select that they have male children, which means that there's a higher rate of men in India than women. We'll get into that as we move into a later topic about women and demographics. So let's compare population pyramids so that we can understand the differences between countries and how the population pyramids are structured. So we'll start with Kenya here. Kenya is one that has a more pyramid style structure, so a more triangular structure. And we look at a couple different numbers to understand why it's significant. So in Kenya, we know that they are still developing. They're still early in their development, which means that they have a lot more children than adults. So a lot of people are having more children. So people are having not just 2 or 3 kids, but somewhere 4 or 5 sometimes. And so we see at the bottom, there are a lot more kids in that youngest age, the 0 to 4, and then the 5 to 9 demographic, which means the population of Kenya is going to continue to grow. We also see that there aren't many older people in their society. So as we look at the top of the chart, we can see there aren't a lot of old people in Kenyan society. And that can tell us a little bit about life expectancy, that maybe people aren't expected to live as long there. So in developing countries, people typically don't live as long as in developed countries. And that helps us to understand how the healthcare and the development is in that country. The other thing that we can assume, if we look at Kenya and we look at the bottom of the chart, is that Kenya has a lot of kids, which means those kids are going to grow up and then have kids of their own. And that helps us understand that Kenya is probably going to continue to grow, continue to have this skyrocketing population until that number at the bottom levels off, until they start having less children. So that's one thing that helps us understand about developing countries. In the United States, we can see our population of 330 million people. Our population pyramid is more of a cylinder, so it's going more evenly up. If we look at the bottom, we still see that the bottom number, the 0 to 4, has more than the 5 to 9 and has more than old people, which means we're still growing, but we're growing very slowly. We're not going to add much more each generation of people. And if we look at that top arrow in the United States, we see the arrow at the 50s to 60s. And that is what we know is the baby boom. That's the post-war era where people had a lot of children. And that is our biggest area of growth. That's when the United States population really skyrocketed, when all those people are having children. Now those people are in their post-reproductive years, which means we're not going to see as much growth from them. So they're still the biggest population, even though they're in the older ages. So we're still growing, and we're going to look at a country that is not growing. We're going to see a country that is actually declining in population. So we look at the baby boom of Italy after the war. There's a lot of people there, but when you look under, there are not as many. That means that people aren't having as many children in Italy. So when we look, we can see a few interesting things. Looking at the top chart, we can see that a lot of people died in the war of World War II. And so that's why there's so many more females than males at the top of their chart. Also in developed countries, women just tend to live longer, but the significant difference comes from the war years. And if we look at the bottom, there are less kids being born in 0 to 4 than in the 5 to 9 or the 10 to 14, which means that we can predict that Italy's population is going to start to decline if it hasn't already. So looking at all of those across, we see that the different shapes of the population pyramids help us to understand something about the population of those places. We want to be able to identify the different population pyramids on what they mean when we see them, or predict based on information what a population pyramid will look like. So you don't just have to compare different countries. You can look at the population pyramids of regions within a country, and that can help us to see things specifically about the region. So let's look at China and Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a part of China, but they're also somewhat independent of China. You can see that China is at 1.4 billion people, that Hong Kong has 7.5 million people. So we look, the population of Hong Kong is older than the population of China, which we can assume means that because they have more old people, the healthcare in Hong Kong is better, which we actually know is the case. The healthcare in Hong Kong is better than generally the rest of mainland China. We also see a major dip in the number of children born. And so that means that Hong Kong probably isn't growing as quickly as the rest of China. China also is starting to see a leveling off of their population, and we'll talk about causes for that in topic 2.7. So when we compare different levels of place, different scales of analysis, it helps us to understand the places better. So let's do that within our own country. Let's look at the scales of population. We can go from global, national, regional, local. We've already seen the global. When we look at the United States, we can see our population pyramid goes out in the middle over where the baby boom happened. we see that we're still growing, and then we see that we have more old people and more women who are older than men. But if we look at Alaska, we can see that Alaska has a much younger population than the rest of the United States. You can see as we look at the middle and compare, there's a lot more people in that baby boom age and the working age than in the rest of the United States, and less old people in Alaska. Part of that might say something about the healthcare of Alaska, but a lot of it has to do with old people probably don't want to stay in the harsher climates of Alaska. They might move out to retire somewhere that is a little bit easier to live in. But if we take that and we see like, okay, there are more young people in that era in Alaska, but then we look at a specific area, a city in Alaska, we can see that their population pyramid in one city is extremely different from the rest of the state or the country. So looking at Alatoon's East Borough in Alaska, we can see that there's many more men than women. That helps us understand that there's something happening there that we can't just see on this chart. So we could speculate why that is. And a lot of times when you see more men than women, it's guest workers. It's people moving there to work. We also see not a lot of kids and not a lot of old people, which means the people who work need to be in that working age who move to that town. So I want you to try to make a prediction before I switch to the next slide. Why is this area different than the rest of the state of Alaska? And the answer, if you've ever seen the show, is Deadliest Catch is set in this city. And it's because that is where most of the people go for crab fishing. So in this town, more people go for the harsh conditions because you can make a lot of money, but it's a really hard place to live. So it typically attracts people in those middle-aged male years to be guest workers in that part of Alaska. So we see different countries that have this, where there's a lot of guest workers, and we'll get into some of those as we study it throughout the class. But know that looking at different scales of analysis of places helps us to understand those places a lot better. So today we talked about population pyramids and the sex ratio, which is the number of men per 100 women. We talked about the age breakdowns and dependency ratio of why it's important for us to understand how many people depend on the working age. And then we need to understand how to look at population pyramids in order to get information about the places. So that was one more step in our journey to better understanding our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.